Greetings, friend, and welcome to the Between the Covers podcast, where we are working every day to remove the self-limiting beliefs that are preventing us from becoming the heroes of our own stories. I am Marcus Barr, and today I want to dive into the dynamic relationship between protagonists and antagonists. Before we dive into this topic, I do want to remind you that if you have any questions for the podcast, then you can submit them on my website, and I am happy to be candid and honest in my responses. I want to create a safe and judgment-free place to be able to talk about some of these difficult issues in life. You can also use that same form to submit any ideas for individuals for future hero studies. Now, protagonists and antagonists are probably terms that you're familiar with, and I always saw them in terms of hero and villain. And one of the things that was revealed to me just several years ago, I think it was, is a protagonist and an antagonist are actually very similar to each other. And the way that they are is a hero, or not a hero, a protagonist is the hero of their own story. On top of that, an antagonist is the hero of their own story. I will try and give some examples of what this looks like. If we take a look at, say, Luke Skywalker or Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars franchise, they're the heroes of their own stories. They are trying to do what they think is best for the galaxy and what the Force is telling them to do. Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine, they are antagonistic towards these heroes, yet they themselves are doing what they think is necessary and the best for the galaxy, and they are the heroes of their own stories. I think of the Fellowship in the Fellowship of the Ring. They are striving against Sauron and Saruman and the forces of evil and darkness. Yet these antagonists, they're trying to achieve their own goals that they think is going to be the best for them. And so they themselves are the protagonists in their own, they're not protagonists, they're the heroes in their own stories. As soon as this was revealed to me, I actually started looking at these people very, very differently. It actually even reminds me of the political landscape that we find ourselves in. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, I would say there's individuals on one side more than the other that look at one side as the enemy. They see them as evil. They see them as embodying the worst characteristics that a person, a group, or society can embody, and that they have the right solution. This party has the right solution of what needs to be done in order to make the world, make society, make the country as prosperous as it can be and as safe as it can be. So this group sees themselves as the protagonist in this striving for power within the country. And yet the opposing side that is viewed as the enemy is seen as an antagonist toward this first group. They're trying to do the same thing. They just have a different view of what they believe is going to create safety and security and bring about the prosperity of this nation, of this country. So they are the heroes in their own stories. And the first group is antagonistic toward them in what they're trying to achieve. One of the things that came about, I heard this on a podcast just earlier today, and it fits very perfectly with this example of protagonist, antagonist, and almost how it really is a matter of perspective of who's the hero and who's the villain. And let's face it, most of the time, the ones who win are deemed to be the heroes. The ones who lose are deemed to be the villains. And the winners are the ones who write history. The story that I really want to use as an example here is the story of Medusa in Greek mythology. It's actually very interesting, and I think of myself growing up, I had a very, I would even say, patriarchal view of this story of who was the hero, who was the villain, because in a lot of tellings of the story of Medusa she is this monster who, it's interesting, in earlier stories of her, she doesn't have snakes for hair, but she has like snakes hanging from her belt. But then later editions made it that she had snakes for hair, then more retellings and more editions later, suddenly she has the body of a snake. And I believe it was Ovid who came up with the idea that she was also winged at the same time. So she has wings, she has the body of a snake, she has snakes for hair, but she was constantly viewed as a monster. Even if she was portrayed as being a beauty, she was still monstrous, because if you actually get into the story, it's only men who try and find Medusa. It's men who are trying to kill her, and they get turned to stone, because that's what her gaze does. It petrifies them. So the story that I heard growing up is Medusa was the monster, therefore she was the antagonist, and Perseus was sent to slay her. And I'm going to apologize here because I'm not the best at pronouncing some of these Greek names, but I'm going to do my best. If you get into the story of Perseus, he is sent after Medusa in order to kill her, because King Polydectes of Seriphus wanted to marry Perseus's mother. And for whatever reason, he knew he wasn't going to be able to do that if Perseus was around. What better way to remove the hurdle of marrying this woman than having Polydectes say, you know what? Hey, I've got an adventure for you. Why don't you go after this monster that so many people haven't been able to take down? It was a suicide mission, and Polydectes knew that. It was going to remove Perseus so that he could marry his mother. In this story, from what we know, Perseus heads to the island that Medusa has been exiled to, so to speak, and he is given boons and blessings from the gods. He is given a mirror shield from the goddess Athena. He is given sandals with gold wings from Hermes. He is given a sword from Hephaestus, and Hades even gives him a helm of invisibility. Not invincibility, invisibility. And because of all of these blessings and these boons that he gets from these gods, Perseus is able to go to the island that Medusa is exiled to. And depending on the stories, it varies from the telling. She is either hunting him and he's looking through this mirror shield that Athena has given him in order to figure out where she's at but not be turned to stone, and he cuts her head off. Or I've even heard some tellings that she was just asleep, and while sleeping, Perseus goes and removes her head. It kind of depends on the message that you're trying to get on how heroic Perseus is or how sympathetic of a character Medusa is. So with this, the hero, the protagonist, Perseus, slays the antagonist, Medusa, and then takes her head back home and uses it to turn Polydectes to stone, and essentially removes another antagonist in the story. And one of the things that was mentioned in this story is that when Medusa's head was removed, 2 of her children jumped from the hole in her neck. One was Pegasus, the winged horse, and the other is Chrysaor, something like that, who was a giant wielding a golden sword. But these two are born from the decapitated body of Medusa. And growing up, I heard this tale. There were even some movies about it with like Clash of the Titans that talked about this. And Medusa was always depicted as a monster. Perseus was the hero. And he did a good thing by slaying this monster and being the hero in his story. Clear lines of who is the protagonist, who is the antagonist. Perseus is the protagonist, and Medusa is antagonistic towards him, even though she was exiled. She was living alone on an island. Now, let's look at this from a different telling. For those of you who are sensitive to the topic of rape, then you might want to skip this segment of the story. I do not go into graphic detail, but for some people it can be very triggering. And this was the interesting thing that I heard on this podcast. It was actually the last podcast that was released for the How to Heretic podcast. And they were diving into the story of Medusa, and one of the things that they had mentioned, and I was looking in doing some of my own research, and there are some tellings of this, is that the gods Athena and Poseidon were not very cordial to each other. You could even say that they were antagonistic towards each other. And one day, the character of Medusa is in Athena's shrine. And in this telling, Medusa is depicted as a very fair and beautiful maiden. Once Poseidon sees this, and she is worshiping in Athena's temple, he decides he is going to get at Athena by forcing himself upon Medusa in order to get back at Athena or just antagonize her. Poseidon decides that he is going to force himself upon this fair maiden inside of Athena's temple, and he rapes her. After this happens, does Athena get back at Poseidon for any of this? No. She punishes Medusa, and that's when Athena turns Medusa into a gorgon. She now has snakes for hair, maybe even the body of a snake, has wings on her back, and has the ability to turn people into stone just with her gaze. So she is exiled to this island, and in some stories, Medusa is the only gorgon. In others, she has 2 others. They call them her sisters, but Medusa is the only one who's mortal. But in some of the stories, Medusa has 2 sisters that are immortal, and they are Stheno and Uriel. But regardless, Medusa is exiled to this island. She has been cursed for something that she did not want. She didn't want to be involved in this fight between these two deities. And yet, she was violated and then punished for that violation. That paints a very different picture of the character of Medusa. And now you have a character who is just trying to survive. She is trying to do the best that she can. And yet, men keep coming around to her island in order to kill her. She kind of needs to protect herself, doesn't she? And I know that in Clash of the Titans, she's depicted as being an archer using a bow and arrow in order to fight back, as well as turning people into stone. But if we think about it, she's not going around intentionally doing this to others. Individuals such as Perseus, they are coming to her. They are trying to kill her. That isn't something that a hero or a protagonist would really be honored for. And yet we have this story that portrays Perseus as the hero. He is the protagonist. And yet Medusa is not antagonistic towards Perseus. She's just trying to survive. She's the hero of her own story. She didn't ask to be turned into the Gorgon. She wasn't asked to be given this curse. She wasn't asked to take to term children that were inseminated in her because of the lust and pettiness of a god. And that's what I find very interesting about this story. If we take a look at Medusa, we take a look at someone who is a tragic character in a story. She's not a villain. She's antagonistic, but that's because someone else has goals and objectives that are antagonistic towards her. They both, and all parties involved, view themselves as the protagonists in this story. And that's one of the things that makes this actually quite tricky when we're talking about being the heroes of our own stories. I want people to be the heroes of their stories. Yet one of the things that often comes about is there are those whose goals and objectives do not align with yours. And maybe there are people that are just trying to force you to get in line, to go back to how you used to be, to encourage you to view the world differently so that your views align more with what they believe. That can feel isolating, that can feel like a lot of pressure and a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And in a lot of ways, we either give in, or in some cases, we find ourselves being ostracized, we find ourselves being kicked out, we find ourselves losing out on the love and companionship of friends, family, communities, all because we are choosing to be the heroes of our own stories. And while we can be mad, while we can be upset and angry over what's going on, I think one thing that is important for us to remember is for these people that are being antagonistic towards us, they firmly believe that they are the protagonist in this story. And that's why for me, it is so important for us to be the ones who decide what it is to be the heroes in our own stories. One of the things for me that was a big step in being the hero of my own story was moving away from the faith that I grew up in. It wasn't working for me anymore. I have seen a lot of people who call themselves Christian who say that they follow this God of love and compassion, and I see them as the most vitriolic, evil, mean-spirited individuals who are crying for war. I couldn't be a part of that anymore. I don't want to be a part of that anymore. Now, there are still good Christians out there. It's unfortunate that in the time that we live in, there's just so many examples that are being brought to our eyes of individuals who are doing or saying bad things. Why? Because riling us up and getting an anger response out of us gets us to engage. It gets us to keep watching. It gets us to doom scroll. It gets us to get into comments and discuss how wrong or how evil something is. And then someone else comes in and says, you're wrong and you're evil because of these reasons. We are all trying to be the heroes in our stories. And I do think it is important for us to remember that when we're the heroes of our stories, that's going to make us antagonistic towards others. And others who are trying to be the heroes of their stories, they're going to be antagonistic towards us. And while we need to do everything that we can to protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe, I don't wish harm upon these people. I really don't. I wish that there were a lot of people who just opened their eyes. But that's not my job. My job is to be the best that I can be. My job is to become the hero in my story. Your job is to become the hero in your story. Is that going to look exactly like what I'm doing? Absolutely not. Your story is different than mine. You have different people who are in your life who are influencing you. You have individuals and communities and even groups of people that you either are a part of or they just bristle against you. Regardless, it is important that you become the hero in your story. Just bear in mind that other people who are trying to do the same thing are not going to see things the same as you do. That's just how the world is. Again, until we can get over the judgments and the criticisms about people's either gender identity, about their faith, about their backgrounds, their culture, their race, their religion, until we can get over these things that we use to divide ourselves, then we're going to find individuals who are antagonistic towards us. I wish I could say something nicer about that. I really wish I could. Yet, there are people who I still call friends that don't believe the same thing that I do. And when I told them where I was going and what I needed to do, they didn't become antagonistic toward me. Instead, what they did was say, you have a lot of integrity for following your heart and doing what you need to do. We respect that. And I respect them for continuing to do what they need to. We're all important in some way or another. Take that to heart. Our heroics will have an impact on the people around us. And while you're doing that, I would also encourage you to just be compassionate and empathetic and try and reserve judgment against individuals who are trying to do their best and be the heroes in their own stories, even if it doesn't look the way that you would like it to look. If you're not causing harm to others, there's no problem with that. Be the hero and protect yourself as you need. Give yourself self-care, give yourself space, set up some boundaries, find some new people that you can be around who will love and support you on this journey. Whatever that looks like. We need you. Society needs you. The world needs you. People within your sphere of influence, they need you. And until next time, live strong for today.